Hi everybody, this is Mr. Herring, and I'm going to teach you guys about the last tissue that we're going over, and that's the nervous tissue. And its superpower is to transport information very quickly. I like to think of this like an electrical or telephone line, and it over long distances is able to communicate quickly. So this is less like oh, I need to change your bones and get you to grow, and I have to communicate over a long period of time. This is more like, I want you to move and walk and talk, and I got to communicate to the muscles in your body what to do. The nervous system, or the nervous tissue, is made up of two different types of cells. The main one that we'll be talking about is called the neuron, and this is an example of a neuron. And there's just a few main parts that I want to go over of the neuron. The first one is this long telephone line that I was talking about, and we call that the axon, or sometimes they call them fibers. And so this is a neuron, and the long communicative part that does the actual impulse is called an axon. Then there's a main part here that holds all the cell parts, and we call that the cell body. And we have an example of the nucleus here in the cell body. And then there's two more main parts. At the end of the axon, we call this the axon terminal. So when the impulse comes to the end and we want to go to the next neuron, or tell the brain that you felt something hot, or tell the muscle to move, it's the axon terminal's job is to communicate that to the next structure. And then over here we have what's called dendrites, and dendrites are picking up signals from other axons, from the outside world, from the brain, whatever it is, to send that message. Okay, the next type of cell, and I'll do this in a different color, supports neurons. And there's a whole bunch of different ones. I'm just going to talk about the tissue that supports neurons, and these are called Schwann cells. And Schwann cells make up an insulating over the axon, and that insulation over the axon we call a myelin sheath. So a myelin sheath just sits over the axon, and it speeds up the signal so that it goes faster. So these would be Schwann cells. There's the nucleus of the Schwann cell, and then there's little spaces in between the Schwann cells called the nodes of Ranvier. And the nodes of Ranvier actually help with that speeding up of the signal. Okay, so neurons are special tissues that have the ability to send a chemical electrical signals. We call them nerve impulses, and they're supported by neuroglia, which I gave you an example of Schwann cells, and they insulate and speed up that signal. Okay, next I want to talk about glands, and there's two types of glands. The first type of glands is called an exocrine gland, and an exocrine gland secretes things. What glands do is they secrete things into the body, or on the surface of the body, or the surface of a cavity. Okay, so exocrine glands are special than the other glands because they have this area called a duct, and a duct is just kind of a tube that will carry whatever these cells, so these are the cells of the exocrine gland, and they're producing this liquid. It could be saliva, it could be sweat, and then it goes through a little tube to be excreted on the surface of your skin if it's sweat, or inside your mouth if it's saliva. Okay, so these are called ducts. That's what the tube is called, and exocrine glands are the only ones that have ducts. If I were to think about what type of things have exocrine glands, the pancreas does, sweat glands have it, salivary glands are it as well. Endocrine glands are a little bit different because they do not have the ducts. If you look closely here, this would be an endocrine gland cell, and it just produces whatever liquid or chemical that it wants to release, and it releases that chemical directly into the blood, and there's no tube. So this cell would sit right next to a capillary, and it would release it right into the blood. Endocrine glands are more long acting. They're not just like you're sweating for a little bit and you want to secrete a little bit of that, or you've eaten and you want to digest it, so you're releasing some stomach acid or something like that. Endocrine glands are like releasing hormones into your body to tell your body, okay, you need to mature more, you need to grow bones more, whatever kind of hormone we have. They're a little bit longer lasting. Some examples of some glands that are endocrine glands: pituitary, hypothalamus, thyroid, parathyroid, adrenal gland, etc. Finally, the last thing I want to talk about today are the different membranes. And we've already talked about some of the membranes. The first one, I want to just review of the membrane that we talked about. It's called the serous membrane. And the serous membrane is inside the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavity. And so what the serous membrane does is the double layer membrane, with the inner layer being the visceral part of the membrane and the outer layer being the parietal part of the membrane. So you have the visceral and the parietal, and those are the two types of membranes. The next one I want to talk about is called the mucous membrane, or mucosa. And a mucous membrane is any membrane that has a connection to the outside world. So you can know like your nose and your mouth and your throat and your digestive system. These membranes are constantly releasing mucus, and that's to try and protect against invaders in case like a bacteria or virus comes in. So those are special membranes that produce mucus. Finally, the next three, the next one is called the synovial membrane, and the synovial membrane goes around joints, freely moving joints called synovial joints, and they release a fluid inside to help shock absorb and cushion and make movement easier. We have the outside membrane, which is called your cutaneous membrane, and your cutaneous membrane is like your skin, and it protects us, and you can see that it has some sweat glands there with the ducts going towards it. And finally, your meninges is your brain membranes, and they help nourish and keep your brain and your spinal cord functioning correctly. All of these membranes are both epithelial and connective tissue, and their job is to kind of hold things together and keep everything together. This last drawing shows you 4 of the membranes that I talked about, and it just kind of helps you see that it's made of both epithelial and connective tissue, and that's what membranes usually have, is both the epithelial and the connective tissue.